Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Rockies Daily. I'm your host, Scott Ayers, where we talk all things Rockies baseball. And first, let's start with Brett Pill, the new hitting coach for the Colorado Rockies. And Pill is going to have his hands full, needless to say. The Rockies were second in strikeouts last year, only behind the Dodgers, which is a nice company to be in. But unlike the Dodgers, they really didn't produce anything when it came to actually scoring runs, finishing in the bottom 10 in home runs and in the bottom 5 in RBIs. This is a team that really just struggled with any sort of hitting production. And this is a team that had a silver slugger in Hunter Goodman and have some quality pieces in the lineup. So for Brett Pill, it is going to be quite the task to kind of figure out what needs to be fixed for this team. Obviously, strikeout rate is going to be the biggest thing. And head skipper Warren Schaefer was feeling pretty positive about this hire. He talked about how Pill does a really good job working with individual batters and how he can fix whatever's going on with their swing. And that's going to be pretty important going into 2026 because there's really no reason for a Colorado Rockies team to finish in the bottom 10 in many hitting categories, right? Striking out, fine, but this is a team that should be producing runs. And with a hire like this, the hope is Pill's able to work with some of the guys that had their struggles, right? You think of a Brenton Doyle who was able to figure things out at the end of last year. At least he played better in the second half of the season. But that is one of the main hopes moving into 2026 is can you find some of those marginal improvements in the lineup? I think you absolutely can. I don't think that's a crazy thing to ask, nor is it a crazy thing to expect. But that being said, this team did win less than 50 games. And because of that, you do have to have somewhat lower expectations. But there should definitely be improvement. Pill was obviously with the Dodgers for the last 5 years in the minor league system. He has that experience working and helping improve guys' swings. The hope is he can do that for the Rockies. As we are talking about improving the Rockies, the Rockies obviously need some help when it comes to power. We just mentioned they could not hit too many. They didn't hit too many home runs last year. They struggled just scoring runs in general. And there's still a real need at first base for the Rockies. Charlie Condon is a prospect we're expecting to be brought up in 2026. But at the end of the day, he is still a prospect. It is not a guarantee that he's going to be brought up and start hitting bombs left and right. So in the meantime, there has to be a filler. There has to be a building block player for the Rockies, especially at first base. Josh Bell just got signed by the Minnesota Twins, which means now there's one less option. I think one interesting guy to look at is maybe Rhys Hoskins. He had a down year. He's obviously recovering from that ACL injury from 2023, so he just isn't necessarily the same batter that he once was, but his slugging is still over 400, about 419. And so for the Rockies, I think this is a name that you absolutely look at. He's not going to be overly expensive. Maybe he gives you a couple of seasons as you wait for some of the prospects to come in, but that could be really all that you ask for, right? You don't need someone to come in and be an MVP caliber player. That would be awesome. I think we'd all love to find an MVP just hanging there for a $4 million contract, but that's just not how that's going to work. Instead, what you're hoping from Hoskins is that he can just be productive, right? So that's one free agent name that I would look at. If the Rockies happen to trade someone like Brenton Doyle, I think maybe you look at someone like Marcell Ozuna as someone that maybe you put in the outfield. Again, his slugging dipped to about 400. But those are the kind of contracts that you might be looking at because a Brenton Doyle trade most likely means you're getting prospects. You're probably getting pitching in return. So there's going to be maybe one more spot open in the outfield. And so those are at least things to consider. I don't think Ozuna is that likely. I think someone like Rhys Hoskins, though, makes a ton of sense. And it makes sense especially because he still has power. He could still provide a lot in that regard to this lineup that just desperately needs it. And so as the Rockies kind of navigate this free agency in which we've all been kind of sitting on our hands, right? The moves they made have just been building out their staff in terms of who's coaching, pitching, hitting, assistant GM, etc. But I think we're kind of at this point where it's like, what are we going to do? There's rumors of Brenton Doyle, but that's about it. We heard about Willie Castro for today, And I was like, oh my gosh, what are we cooking? And it turns out it's just, it's not even vegetable soup. It's like just broth in a can, and we haven't even heated up the can. That's how it feels right now with the free agent signings, and that could be just what this free agency looks like for the Rockies. I do think they'll splash on a first baseman. Splash meaning probably someone who is hopefully at least average, right? And that can just fill that void for the time being. But until then, we'll just kind of have to wait and see. Instead, I think there's more likely a chance that we could see a potential trade. And, we've seen so much about Brenton Doyle. We've heard so much about teams being interested dating back to last season before the trade deadline that I started to think about, hey, who are some other assets that the Rockies have? Because let's face it, Colorado probably has one of the worst assets in sports in Chris Bryant. It's a contract that only his mother could love, right? It's just not tradable. He's just going to be a Rocky unless he has just a magical start to 2026 and you're able to somehow move him. That's just the case. The thing is, though, the Rockies do have some quality assets. Now, I do think they range from guys that are, very tradable to nearly untouchable, but I don't think the Rockies should list anyone as an untouchable. I think there are guys like Tovar and Hunter Goodman where it's like, unless you give us a great contract or a great trade offer, we're not interested. I think that's reasonable, especially someone like Hunter Goodman. He's coming off an All-Star. He's coming off of a Silver Slugger. He was, by all definitions, the best player on the Rockies last season. And he's a catcher who can hit, and he could be someone that teams are very interested in. But if I'm Colorado, I don't show any interest in trading him away unless you are getting a king's ransom in return. That should be your view on someone like Hunter Goodman, because players like him are pretty rare to come by. Of having a catcher with that kind of power that obviously had the success that he had. Same with Tovar, who defensively is obviously extremely talented. He obviously dealt with some injuries last season, but still, again, another guy that you have to have some building pieces, and you have to have some guys that you build a core around. Those are two names, obviously, that I think come to mind right away. Jordan Beck being another just because of his age. He's only 24 years old. He's a younger outfielder. And because Brenton Doyle is on the other end of things where it feels like he's most likely to be traded, you do want to have some quality pieces in the outfield, and Jordan Beck is one of those. Really, the other two names that you might see is the reliever, Victor Vodnik, who had actually a pretty impressive year last year out of the bullpen. He's another name that he's a younger reliever. The Rockies probably value him at a point where unless you get a good offer, you hold on to him. But he is one of those names that you could see dealt at the deadline for a couple of, top 30, top 40, top 50 prospects. The last name that came to my mind when kind of looking over this, and this is something that we'll be able to dive into further in the offseason, right? We're going to have all the time in the world to talk about these players individually, is someone maybe like Kyle Freeland, right? I could see him actually being more likely to be dealt if he has a strong start to the 2026 season. Big part of that is just his time frame really doesn't match the Rockies. Unless Colorado pulls a rabbit out of the hat and they start, 15 games over 500 and I actually have a meaningful chance to, make a wild card push, which again, it would take a miracle, which I'm not complaining about if it happens. That's a name that you would consider trading. His best days are most likely behind him, so the odds of him starting out hot aren't necessarily that strong. However, if someone is needing, that fourth or fifth starter as they're making a playoff push, Freeland is a guy that could fit that role. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Freeland and Doyle are probably the two most likely guys to be dealt before the 2026 deadline. Doyle feels like it could be something that happens, during the offseason. Again, this staff has talked about, hey, we want to, make some shakeups and changes that make the most sense. There's no real timeline on that. It could be something that there are legit conversations happening right now. We see something within the week. Could be something where, hey, we get to next trade deadline and he's still on the team. But Doyle does feel like the biggest name when it comes to a potential trade. And it's funny we talk about Doyle so much because I would argue that the best position group on the Rockies was the outfield. Jordan Beck, Brenton Doyle, and Mickey Moniak, who really had a positive 2025. His was the most impressive just because he struggled so much with the Angels. He comes to Colorado, and he really actually had a solid season, an 824 OPS, 60-plus RBIs. All three outfielders had more than 50 RBIs, which obviously doesn't sound that impressive, but for a team that struggled to drive in runs, this was the bright spot. And these are the guys that you actually can take away a nice silver lining for, where all the other struggles were the outfield actually you look at and say, hey, that's a pretty competent outfield. And that's where it becomes difficult when you talk about dealing someone like Brenton Doyle, because you just don't know if you can replace him with someone that can match, obviously, his defense, right? His defense is second to none. They won't find anyone as good as him when it comes to being just a defensive outfielder. But still, he can be productive at the plate. He hit nearly 300 at home. It was just a problem that he hit, below 200 on the road. And I think part of that is just he struggled last season, but I expect him to bounce back. But this outfield overall, I think we should feel pretty confident about moving into 2026, as well as, they still have someone like Zach Veen, who he struggled at the major league level, but I still think there is something there when it comes to Veen. So the Rockies, they're obviously talking about making moves. They're talking about maybe making some different signings, but when it comes to a position group as a whole, you obviously have Hunter Goodman at catcher, which is probably the biggest lock of anyone on the lineup. But then you also look at the outfield and say, hey, these actually all feel like pretty quality starts across the board. And it's just really fixing up the rest of the team, basically the entire infield. And then you'll start to feel a little bit better about that. But obviously as free agency goes on, we'll see the kind of moves that the Rockies make or don't make. We're all kind of just sitting on our hands. But until next time, I'm Scott Ayers. Hope you liked the video. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Until then, I hope you have a great rest of your day.